listening to Driving Law, a podcast by Kyla Lee about all things related to the rules of the road.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Driving Law. I am Kyla Lee at Acumen Law Corporation, and I don't have a co-host this week, so you're just stuck with me and the driving law-related issues that I can tell you about. And I thought that we'd kind of have a theme this week on safety, specifically safety around driving, and some issues that have been becoming patterns in British Columbia. So I wanted to start out by talking about motorcycles because it's been very surprising news to a lot of people that from March to May this year, the number of deaths involving people on motorcycles has been triple what it was in the previous year. And there's no, particularly obvious reason why that is. Of course, we know motorcycles are often frequently referred to as donor cycles. That's because they are more likely to cause you to die or be injured. I think ICBC statistics on them say that you're 3 times more likely to be injured or killed in a crash compared to a driver in a car. Obvious reasons for that, not the same safety circumstances in place. But from March to May this year, there were 14 people who died on motorcycles across the province, and only 5 last year. And car drivers are definitely getting used to motorcycles on the roads as the summer weather heats up. And our road features haven't changed significantly. The weather has been relatively nice, which may get more people on motorcycles out on the roads, but it's not that much nicer this year than it was last year. The death numbers are quite high. And again, there doesn't really appear to be a consistent reason for this, but I think there is something to take into account here, and that's that there never really is a steady number of motorcycle-related fatalities in British Columbia. Statistics that I have go back to 2016, where there were 6, 2017 there were 2, 2018 7, 2019 10, 2020 and 2021 7, although, asterisks on anything that it's in 2020 and 2021. In 2022, there were only 5 motorcycle-related deaths, but then there were 12 in 2023, 6 in 2024, 5 in 2025, and 14 in 2026. So it's not consistent. And these statistics tell us something more about public safety when it comes to driving. We often hear ICBC, the Superintendent of Motor Vehicles, the provincial government, spinning driving-related statistics as a basis to say that, their programs are working, that the immediate roadside prohibition regime, for example, is effective at deterring drunk drivers and reducing alcohol-related fatalities. But if you look at the numbers, it's not like they are ever in a pattern that shows a consistent impact by the immediate roadside prohibition scheme. And similarly, with motorcycle-related deaths, it really just tends to be happenstance as to why it is that some years there are significantly more deaths than others. And so I think the fact that the headline is disturbing. The headline certainly says something about deaths and danger on the roadway and motorcycles. It doesn't actually mean anything in terms of there being any more particular risks this year than there are any other years. There's nothing that the government can do to change this situation so that next year it's down to 5 or 2 or even fewer. Um, and in British Columbia, from 2021 to 2025, there have roughly been the same number of crashes in BC involving at least one motorcycle, and roughly the same number of injuries involving at least one motorcycle, between 1,300 and 1,400 every year, and between 2,100 and 2,300 as well. So it's not even like the statistics about motorcycles are changing. It just seems to be just sheer luck of the draw. And I think if we think back to our ridiculous driver a couple of weeks ago, the individual whose motorcycle was left hanging from the signpost, we can see that, some situations are gonna be far worse than others. Even when I was driving home on the highway, yesterday from court, I saw a motorcycle accident, that the police were there investigating. And it wasn't clear to me whether, anybody was injured or killed, but it's another situation of it just happens to be luck of the draw. And that's, I guess, a risk that motorcycle riders take. But not everybody who takes risks on the road is somebody who is, as a motorcycle rider, would be informed about the nature of that risk. Somebody who, as a motorcycle rider, would be willing to undertake that risk. Sometimes there are people who are not able to appreciate the nature of the risk that they're facing. And this week saw a North Vancouver RCMP pulling over, essentially, an e-scooter that was being ridden by a 12-year-old. And it ultimately, oh, sorry, no, it wasn't a pullover. It was an accident. It was an accident involving an e-scooter, 12-year-olds on the e-scooter. I'm gonna come back to something about 12, but the e-scooter rules in British Columbia, don't allow people operating under the pilot project to be under the age of 16. So while we have these e-scooters available for rent on the roadways, or you can purchase your own e-scooter and use it on the roadways, you can't do that if you're under the age of 16. And if you're a parent listening to this podcast, you cannot let your under 16 child use an e-scooter, whether it's one they borrow from friends or family member or you, or one that you rent for them or purchase for them. It is not permitted to be used on roadways in BC under the pilot project. And so there was a collision this week in North Vancouver between an e-scooter and a vehicle. The child riding the e-scooter, the 12-year-old, struck a black Volkswagen Jetta. Minor injuries to the child. Nobody seriously hurt. And the police ultimately followed up with the child's guardian and gave several tickets to both, it seems like both to the child and the guardian. The news stories just say several tickets were issued, including one to the guardian for allowing a person under 16 to operate an e-scooter. But there are also, of course, tickets that can be issued to somebody under 16 for operating an e-scooter. And if an e-scooter is being operated outside of the pilot project, it's also technically a motor vehicle. So this is a weird thing about the law in British Columbia. An e-scooter both is and is not a motor vehicle, depending on who is riding it, where it's being ridden, and the surrounding circumstances. So under the BC Motor Vehicle Act, of course, anything that is motorized is required to have a license and insurance, other than designated personal mobility devices like wheelchairs and certain other designated devices, e-bikes that meet the requirements of the regulations, which has been a point of frustration and contention for many people, and scooters under the e-scooter pilot project. But because the e-scooter pilot project only applies in certain municipalities, you can be riding an e-scooter in North Vancouver and not be on a motor vehicle. But if you were riding it in Kitimat, it would be a motor vehicle because the pilot project doesn't exist in Kitimat. So the same device can and cannot be a motor vehicle at the same time. It's like Schrodinger's motor vehicle, if you want to think about it that way. And the other thing that changes the nature of this particular incident is that because everything must be done within the meaning of the pilot project in order for the e-scooter to be a motor vehicle or not a motor vehicle, as the case may be, if a 12-year-old is operating it, it still is legally functioning as a motor vehicle, which means probably tickets that could have been issued in this case include driving on the sidewalk, driving without due care and attention, driving without assurance, driving without a license. I think there's an offense for being under the age of 16 and on an e-scooter. And you might think, well, the kid's 12 years old. That's the age at which you can be charged with offenses in Canada. So under 12, you can't be charged. This kid was like right on the cusp of not having to face any consequences other than the injuries, and whatever their parents do to them, for their actions. But unfortunately, based on being 12, could have been given tickets, and I suspect likely were. Um, and so the other rules governing e-scooters that people should keep in mind is you should be wearing a helmet. You can't go faster than 25 kilometers an hour. And they can't be driven on sidewalks, except for when they can be driven on sidewalks, because in some municipalities they are permitted to be driven on sidewalks, but that's more complicated. And if you're operating an e-scooter in any municipality, you should probably pay attention to the specific rules in the municipality that you're in. So, on the one hand, we see motorcycles where there's this voluntary assumption of risk. People know that there can be a significant number of deaths related to motorcycles. People, I think, when you're old enough to get on a motorcycle, you have enough common sense to know that you're at a greater risk of death or injury in an accident because you are more vulnerable. You're not trapped in a metal cage that has, airbags and things like that. And then you have on the middle of the spectrum individuals who are not falling within the scope of the pilot project, children who are not necessarily appreciating the nature of the risk that they're taking on, operating an e-scooter and suffering minor injuries. But they're going to be fine, and it's going to be an expensive and painful lesson for them. But then there's the far end of the spectrum. And this, I think, brings us to something that was quite tragic, that happened, in BC this week, which is that there was an ATV or an off-road vehicle, being operated in the north, and that device, unfortunately, crashed and, rolled over. There were a number of people on the ATV, 3 of whom were children, and, they unfortunately all died. It's an incredibly tragic incident, very, very sad, but it's also something that never should have happened. The person who was operating the ATV that, this incident happened, involving was only 7 years old. And you have to ask, where are the parents when something like this is going on? Because the law does not permit in British Columbia children, people under the age of 16, to be operating these ATV devices. So the accident occurred because somebody who probably also didn't meet the minimum weight requirements for operation of the device was operating it with passengers, and they weren't old enough to be operating it. And that's the far end of the spectrum of safety that when we think about motor vehicle accidents and we think about the Motor Vehicle Act, we think about. I think a lot of us, we feel frustrated at motor vehicle laws. We feel the oppression of the state. I certainly get a lot of clients approaching me, saying that the law is silly and it doesn't function to protect people. But when you think about the requirements for certain vehicles to have licenses and insurance, it makes a lot more sense in the context of the fact that you don't want a child getting on it, because if it's not a motor vehicle act, then the Motor Vehicle Act can't govern its use and operation, which means there has to be a separate law dealt with to prevent children from exposing themselves to harm. And these devices are capable of significant power. And the tragic case that we see coming out of the north this week is the perfect example of how a simple incident that seems like it probably would just be fun on a device where there is no external protection, no airbags, not the same safety features, can have the worst possible consequences. And that drives home the importance of why we have these motor vehicle related laws and all-terrain vehicle related laws in British Columbia. It is for that reason that these laws exist, to prevent people from ending up in a situation where they are seriously harmed as a result of this. And if you are a person who is considering operating a vehicle, or letting your child or family member or friend under the age of 16 operating any type of vehicle that has any type of motor, I would encourage you not to do it. Not only could you face potentially up to thousands of dollars in fines and tickets, you could also face the most tragic consequences. And only those people who are licensed and have demonstrated the appropriate safety and knowledge, like motorcycle riders are required to do before they get a license, should be permitted to get on these devices. Now, as we talk about licensing, I think it's also important to talk about some big changes that have been announced to licensing in British Columbia. So, ICBC has announced a major change to driver testing in BC, and I have some thoughts about it. It was this week that ICBC announced not just that we have all of these changes where the second road test is going to be eliminated, but also, drivers are now able to take their knowledge test online, which means they don't have to go into ICBC and wait for an in-person appointment to perform the knowledge test. It doesn't apply to people who are getting a commercial driving license, so class 1 to 4. So it's only if you're getting your L. And this is, helpful. On the one hand, it's helpful for people in rural and remote communities. It's helpful for people in communities that are underserved in terms of the population versus the amount of ICBC resources they have to take the tests. There are positives that come out of it that way. But there are also negatives that come out of it because this is an online test. It's not watched over, right? Like when you go and take your knowledge test at ICBC, it's been a long time since I took my knowledge test, but when you go take your knowledge test at ICBC, it's not like you're sitting there with your phone being able to look up the answer to every question. But there's no way to prevent you from doing that when you are taking the knowledge test at home. So, to the extent that the knowledge test is being done, ICBC has tried to eliminate the potential for cheating. But I don't think that the mechanism they have in place is going to be sufficient. Essentially, the new online method will require people to be using a computer that has a camera and a secure internet connection. You can't do it on your phone. Your webcam is supposed to stay on during the entire test to help prevent it. But that doesn't mean that it's going to prevent cheating. Like now they do in universities, they do exams that are proctored via camera, where at the beginning of the exam you need to show the entire room around you to show that there's nothing that you could cheat with, but there's a person that's live that's monitoring it at the same time that you're doing it. To my knowledge, the way that they've described this, ICBC isn't doing live monitoring. They're going to probably review the footage if an issue comes up. I can't imagine that somebody is going to watch every video of every person taking every knowledge test that's being taken in the province to look for signs of cheating. And what's not captured on camera is not going to be something that's known to ICBC. So if you are you write your answers on a whiteboard on the other side of your computer. If you copy the answers onto the floor and you just look down and you can see the floor, like there are ways to cheat on the exam. And I worry that between this and the elimination of the second road test, ICBC and the provincial government really is prioritizing cost savings over public safety. And we know this is about money because in their announcement, they've said that this is going to save millions of dollars. That it's going to be something that is going to save time. They're obviously going to have to decrease the number of staff that were working as counter agents at ICBC. They're decreasing the in-person appointments. All of that saves the government money. Fewer road tests and fewer in-person learning tests all or knowledge tests all just save money. But the cost savings are likely to come with a public safety consequence. And I know I said at the beginning of this podcast that we shouldn't read too much into the statistics that the government gives us in terms of what is and isn't happening surrounding accidents. But if you can take your motorcycle knowledge test, which you can online, if you can take your driver's knowledge test online, and then you can have one road test that you pass, followed by no second road test to confirm that after the 2-year period you're still a safe driver, we are unleashing people who have very little actual monitoring of their circumstances on the public. And that could have potential consequences. We're not going to see those consequences immediately. It's not like the number of deaths and crashes and injuries are going to go up. They're not going to spike next year. Like there's not going to be obviously this motorcycle situation is it's an anomaly and it's not an anomaly because as I gave you with the statistics earlier, there are lots of years that have had a similar number of motorcycle deaths. But we're not going to see the impact of this probably for 5 years. And let's mark my words, in June of 2031, if I'm still doing this podcast, then let's look at the numbers and see whether there has been an increase in motorcycle-related deaths and accidents on the roadway. We know that the number of deaths and injuries have remained relatively consistent. Um, we went through those numbers. Let's look at whether there's an increase in deaths overall on the roadways, whether there's an increase in crashes. Because I'd be willing to bet that as we strip away the procedural protections that serve to protect the public from dangerous drivers, we are going to put ourselves in a situation where we do expose the public to greater risk of death and injury caused by w- dangerous drivers who've not been properly scrutinized. And yeah, some of the reasons you can fail your road test are stupid. I know I failed my first road test for a stupid reason. And some people who don't pass their road test probably do deserve to pass their road test, and vice versa. Somebody might just have a very lucky day when they're driving. But that doesn't mean that we should just scrap the whole thing. So with that, on that note, let's change topics entirely and talk about
The ridiculous driver of the week.
because this week's ridiculous driver is fantastic. You can find it on 7 News Australia. If you're on TikTok, you can go to their page, but it'll be on their website as well. It is a woman from Sydney, Australia, who was charged with impaired driving. The whole thing is caught on camera. She's at the grocery store. She gets in her car. She's backing out of her parking stall, and she basically just veers in a semicircle into the car behind her at a high rate of speed, then puts her car in gear, tries to pull away, goes backwards again, again another semicircle into another car, and smashes into like 4 or 5 cars, just kind of circling around the parking lot, intentionally moving the vehicle. It's not like she's picking off them. Before parking the vehicle, getting out, throwing some sort of a bottle in the bush, and the police, of course, came and arrested her, and she was charged. Yeah, she was 5 times the legal limit. But the video is really, I mean, the driving is very dangerous, and she's lucky, and everybody's lucky that nobody was actually hurt in the accident. But the video is hilarious, and definitely worth watching. So I would recommend giving that a good watch if you can. And we will see you next week for another exciting episode of Driving Law.